Hey everybody. So we're going to look at chapter 6 here, Making War and Republican Governments, 1776-1789. So in this chapter we're going to look at the Revolutionary War. We're going to look at the financial crisis that comes about during and after the war. We're also going to look at this new idea in colonial government, this idea of factionalism, which is what really leads to political parties. We'll look at the Articles of Confederation and the creation of the Constitution. So the last chapter ended with us discussing how the war really began, the first shots of the war around Boston. Then there's about a year of not compromise, about a year of discussion and debate, and as both sides really come to terms what's about to happen. England prepares for war, and America is still generally trying to decide whether they want war or not. It's really not clear. Well, we get the war. First couple of years of the war, it did not go well. Most Europeans believed this war would be short. Most people believed it would be short. These upstart colonies with no actual military going to war with the British Empire, what may have been the most powerful empire in the world. Most thought England would easily defeat the colonials. English military were strong, America was weak regarding economic power, military power, naval power, uh, pretty much any category you can think of. England had the advantages. The American Army, which is what we end up calling the Continental Army, George Washington's Continental Army, was small and poorly trained, and for the first 2 years, never reached above about 18,000 soldiers. Luckily, the British military never had even quite that many soldiers in the colonies. Even though they were far better trained, they never really brought their full power to bear upon the United States, this isn't the United States, upon the colonies before it became the U.S. They never really brought their full military might to bear upon the colonies. Remember, they were global. They had colonies all over the world. We were just one of many, and they had to deal with any other colonies that might have some ideas of revolution or revolt, which was actually pretty common. India, for instance, was constantly problems in India. So, had the British military ever brought their full power against us, we would have been quickly overwhelmed. They did not, though. Early on, the Americans retreated primarily, especially as the Redcoats attempted to take over Boston, take over New York. We generally see Washington's army retreat, almost always. Washington spent most of his time the first 2 years of the war just running from the British, which was good because had he ever taken his army in a face-to-face battle with the British, he would have been destroyed. The war would have been over right then. Washington knew this. He was smart enough to know this. Washington was a great strategist, if that's the right word. He was smart when it came to strategy. He understood how to play this game. He had been in the British military. He had worked with them. He understood. There were a couple of successes Washington had early on, a couple of small successes. For example, the famous story of Washington crossing the Delaware River. He caught the British off guard, and he captured about 1,000 German soldiers, German mercenaries working for the British. So there were a few small victories, but most of the time, 3 out of 4 times, Washington ended up retreating from battles with the British. His soldiers were good at this. Most of these soldiers lived out on the frontier. They lived in the woods. They were farmers, laborers. They knew basically to scatter into the woods, and the British did not usually give chase. During the winter, the British would always stop fighting. It was tradition for the British Army. In the winter, they would stop. They would bivouac, I think is the right word. They would bed down for the winter. They would find a place secure. They would secure it. They would put up defenses. They would take over a small town or village. And they didn't usually fight in the winter months. In Europe, it's very difficult to fight in the winter. Winters are very wet, cold, below freezing temperatures, snow, ice, mud. It's hard to fight a war in the winter in Europe when there is no roads and things like that in many places. So, however, Washington found some of his biggest successes during that winter. The Delaware, for instance, when he crossed the Delaware and he captured those soldiers, those German soldiers working for the British. So a lot of his success he actually found in the winter months when the British were not really fighting. The very famous lines you may have heard, these are the times which try men's souls. Well, that was Thomas Paine. He wrote it during this winter, this first winter of 76 to 77. It really looked bleak. It really looked in that first year that Washington was just one defeat away from total defeat. If the British Army had managed to capture the majority of his army and capture him and some of his officers, that would have been it. The war would have been over right there. They didn't, though, and the war continues on. As I'll say more than once in this chapter, at any time in this conflict, in the first 3 years, certainly, uh, any number of things could have happened to end this war for the Americans. Truthfully, if we were to do this over again, if there was like some alternate universe, alternate history, and this war were fought again 100 times, in truth, 90 out of 100, 95 out of 100 times, we would lose. We should not have won this war. Truthfully, there were so many things going against us. Washington had ever been captured, it would have been over. Had they ever captured the Continental Congress, it would have been over. Had the French not come to help us, the Spanish come to help us, it would have been over. Um, there's just so many things in here that if it had gone the other direction on any one of these things, a dozen different things, if it had just gone the other way even one time, that would have been it. This is pretty amazing that we won this conflict. This gives you an idea of the Patriot strongholds are the reddish, Loyalist are the blue. These are places that are very loyal to England. Some of them are loyal because they're actually loyal. They believe in the English crown. Some of them are simply loyal because they are surrounded by soldiers. There's soldiers everywhere. Um, they're militarily controlled areas, districts. For instance, New York, military controlled district. Not because they were really loyal, but the redcoats are everywhere there. So some of these places are loyal for different reasons, by choice or by coercion. New England up here, and then the green areas are very contested areas, contested locations. And it might be interesting to think about. We usually would think about the war as the war between the Patriots and the Redcoats. You must understand there was actually a lot of internal conflict too between colonials, between loyal colonials and Patriot colonials. So there were multiple skirmishes and fights actually between American colonials fighting each other, which had nothing to do with the Redcoats. Because there was still a significant portion of the population, maybe a third of the entire population that was still relatively loyal to England, that didn't really believe in this whole revolution, really didn't think it was just or appropriate. Or maybe they were just worried about money and they were worried about the economic challenges to it, which are terrible, or the loss of trade, which bankrupted many people. Trials of War of the Continental Army. This Continental Congress promised 75,000 soldiers to Washington. He never, through the entire war, in his first 2 years, he didn't get above about 18,000. But through the entire war, he never got above 25,000 soldiers at one time. Congress promised triple that. They could never even get close to delivering it. There was times in the middle of the war that Washington was down to like 8,000 men. British had twice that many, and they were well-trained professional soldiers. Um, Very difficult to get people recruited into the military too. Very difficult. You got to understand they're being told that they're going to have to fight in the winter, in the snow, the ice. It's going to be violent. They may die. If you were a hardcore patriot, yeah, but a lot of people were simply on the fence about this whole conflict. And they're like, I'm not sure if I want to fight or not. I'm not sure if we should be doing this or not. Oh, and you want me to go die for it? I mean, look what it is today. Think about how many of you out there watching this have actually been in the military. I was in the military, served 8 years. But how many of you have done it? Very few. There's a couple of you, but very few. Most people don't join the military. And today, the military is actually much safer. Today, fatality rates in the United States military are incredibly low. They're like fractions of a percent. You hear the horror stories, of course, of the soldiers that die, the tragic soldiers stories of soldiers dying, but the actual percentage of soldiers that die in U.S. military for an entire 20-year term, it's a fraction of a percent. It's incredibly small, incredibly unlikely that you will actually be injured or die in the military. Back then, the percentage was much higher. Washington at one point was losing. In 1 year alone, he lost like 30% of his soldiers dead from injuries or froze to death or starved to death. 30% in the, I think, winter of 77, 78. So the mortality rates were incredibly high. And you've got many people that aren't even sure about this fight in the first place. And you want them to volunteer to go in, and it was really tough. Really, really tough. Ultimately, most of Washington's soldiers are not patriots. Most of Washington's soldiers are common men, laborers, immigrants. A lot of them don't even speak English, that are bribed in that they'll get free land or they're coerced into it. Indentured servants, indentured servitudes are forced to, indentured servants are forced to fight. The stories of like the Patriots are like the American heroes. Well, they are because they fought and I mean, they helped found our country. But understand, they didn't see themselves that way. For most of them, they were forced into this, or they felt they had to do it through coercions or bribery. It was tough. It was really tough. Almost all were inexperienced. Desertions were common. In one winter alone, Washington lost like 3,000 soldiers that just got up and walked away. We'll actually talk about that Valley Forge here in a minute. It was bad. Um, the people that kept this war going were the Patriots. But the actual soldiers that fought and died on a daily basis, most of them had no real vested interest in this conflict. And frankly, didn't care. It was a job or a means to an end for most soldiers. In 1777, British General Howe took Philadelphia. Why Philadelphia? Howe took Philadelphia because the Continental Congress was meeting there at one point. He assumed this was a cut the head off the snake strategy. He assumed if he captured Philly, he could potentially capture the Congress, and that might end the war. You capture the government, that might end the war. And it might have. Well, there were spies on both sides of this conflict for both sides. So the Continental Congress got word of this. They knew how it was coming. The British Army moved very slow too. They marched really slowly. So you could probably see them from a distance and have time to run. Anyway, they escape. I think they flee to New York. They escape and go to New York, I think. Well, then these two generals get a bright idea. Howe and Burgoyne get some bright ideas, which were unfortunately didn't work well. It was a mistake, but they didn't know it at the time. They thought it was smart. So Howe takes Philadelphia, and they get away. The Continental Congress gets away. But then a British army led by Burgoyne is then left alone. What happens is Howe and Burgoyne were together, and they had, I don't know, something like 10,000 soldiers, which was an army that Washington never could have probably touched. A 10,000 redcoat army would have been an unassailable force for Washington's But they split up, leaving Burgoyne by himself at Saratoga, New York. Well, Washington hears about this. He does his maneuvers, his strategy, whatever it is. He actually ends up surrounding Burgoyne, and he forces Burgoyne to surrender. Massive victory. The largest victory Washington had up to this point, the largest victory really of the entire war until the end, was this capturing of Burgoyne, capturing of about 5,000 British soldiers. There wasn't much fighting and shooting either. Burgoyne realized he was surrounded. He was in a bad position. There was no escape. He was in a bad position, a bad place. Washington had maybe 15,000 soldiers, so Burgoyne was outnumbered 3-1. Had this actually gone to a real firefight, like to the last man standing, the Redcoats would have probably won, but 10,000 people would have died. Burgoyne realizes this pretty quickly and realizes that his strategy is either to shoot it to last man standing or surrender, and he surrenders, which was a standard strategy in European warfare. It was respected. You weren't supposed to kill all your men. That wasn't the way it worked in European warfare. If possible, you should surrender against unassailable odds, and then your men are supposed to be treated respectfully. They get their weapons taken away, and many times they're actually released to go back home. They'll sign like a contract agreeing not to fight again. Gentlemanly warfare. Well, this is about the end of gentlemanly warfare in Europe because, well, the French Revolution, which occurs in a few years, pretty much proves that. This is about the end of an era of gentlemanly warfare. Napoleon and the French Revolution, all that really shows that. Why is this so huge? Well, number one, the victory, of course, but what is even bigger? At the same time this is happening in America, there are delegates from the Continental Congress in Paris, schmoozing it up with the king in Paris, trying to get the king in Paris, which also I think the government there was also known as Parliament, only spelled a little differently. He was trying to get their assistance. They were trying to get, I think Ben Franklin was there. There's some others trying to get their assistance. It worked because at the time that our delegates are there trying to negotiate with the French to get their help, they get news of the victory at Saratoga, which is a massive victory, capturing 5,000 British soldiers. That's pretty rare. Empires, like large countries like France, couldn't do stuff like that sometimes. So it was impressive. The French agreed to an alliance with us as a result of Saratoga. This is really the path to victory now, is with the French alliance. Without the French, we could have danced around with the British for years, but ultimately, without an alliance like some world power like France, we probably still couldn't have beaten them. And France hated the British. Literally, France and England have been fighting wars with each other since the 1200s. They hate each other. So the French would love an opportunity to take the British down a notch, to knock the king of the mountain down a little bit by taking away the very productive American colonies. And so the French agree. They agree to an alliance. Wonderful! Not that wonderful. It's about 2 years before we even get any help from the French, really. They give some supplies and money and some food and whatnot, but the truth is, we don't really see French soldiers for close to like 2 years before we really see French soldiers. Before they finally show up and really put boots on the ground, as we say. Yeah. It's helpful. It's inspiring. It gives us hope for the future, knowing that another world power has taken our side. They're not the only ones, as I'll talk about in a moment. The Spanish end up joining us too. Both the Spanish and the French would love a chance to knock the British down because the British have been taking stuff from the Spanish and the French for 100 years. The Spanish and the French would love to get some of that back. Well, let's talk about economics. Really bad situation for the colonies. Now, in the North, most of the urban populations, think Philly, New York, Boston, they left. They fled the cities because all those cities were taken over by the British. So with the cities being taken over by the British, we see the colonials leave and go to the countryside. Those that are like patriot leaning, not loyalists. Farmers and artisans in the country, they adapted to a whole wartime economy. They had to, the civilian wartime economy. If you needed something, you had to make it yourself. If you wanted to eat something, you had to grow it, had to cut it, had to go kill it yourself. You wanted to drink something, you had to make it yourself. You wanted clothes, you had to make them yourself. Uh, There was almost no trade going on. With your neighbor, if you needed something, you would trade something with your neighbor. We barter system. That's the way it worked out. It had to work out because trade was much non-existent. The stores were closed, the shops were closed, the whole economy was basically shut down. So women are incredibly significant in this. While the men are fighting, the soldiers are fighting in the woods and fighting the British. Many of them are still, of course, working. Women often are behind the scenes doing all kinds of work. They're taking care of clothes and food and meat, and they're doing so many things behind the scenes in this new wartime economy while the men are fighting, or a lot of the men are fighting. Uh, Very interesting. Very interesting. Very critical. So materials and clothes for the war effort. Well, wartime violence is common, non-soldier violence, or I say that differently, non-war violence. I don't know how to put it exactly. Violence not between soldiers is actually very common in wartime. The battlefield is the war you know, where the soldiers fight and they kill each other. What about all the other stuff that happens behind the scenes? All of the non-battle violence, women being raped, farms being plundered and pillaged, people being kicked out of their farmhouses because the soldiers are going to want a warm place to sleep at night. Animals being taken and slaughtered by the soldiers because they're hungry, regardless of the fact that now the farmers are going to starve to death. You might say, well, the British were doing this, the Redcoats were doing this. The Redcoats did do some of this. So did a lot of Washington's Continental soldiers. You must understand, as I said, many of them were immigrants, many of them were foreigners, many of them were people fresh off the boat. Some of them didn't even speak English. They were being coerced into fighting, many of them. So they were angry, they were frustrated, they were scared, they were cold, um, hungry. It's war. It needs to be noted. We'll talk about it here. We'll talk about it in the Civil War as well. The violence that goes on behind the scenes that isn't on a battlefield is sometimes just as terrible. Uh, Really bad, really bad. Very typical military invasions, and it's both sides doing it. States were often afraid to increase taxes. After all, what was this war based on? In large part, taxation without representation. They didn't want to tax. And so now that the war's going on, what do you have to fight a war? You have to have money. You have to have money to pay people's salaries and to buy goods and supplies and weapons, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't have money. So they couldn't tax because they felt there would be another rebellion. Yes, a rebellion within the rebellion, a rebellion against the rebellion. If we started taxing and started for, because that's one of the reasons people were fighting for this. That was one of the motivations for those people that did actually volunteer to fight, was against the British unfair tactics and strategies and economics. And oh, wait a minute, wait, you're going to tax us now? Anyway, so they didn't really tax, so they couldn't generate money. They did paper money. I mean, they generated paper money, but it was so valuable that by the end of the war, the paper money was often thought to be more useful being tossed in a fireplace to keep you warm at night. That's how valuable it was. Inflation gets so bad that people won't even take the money. It has no value. It's not even worth the paper it's printed on. So um, the Continental Congress, which was basically our government. Our government was basically the Continental Congress. They were financially destroyed. They feared further rebellion as economic problems got even worse. Economic devastation. There was no money. The currency was devalued to the point of nothing. There really was no currency. It was there, but it was useless. Uh, we'll talk more about this after the war ends. But it was bad. It came to the point that much of what Washington's officers did is they just gave IOUs to everybody. Good luck getting that money back. As we take your cows and your farm and your food and everything, here's an IOU. We'd be glad to pay you back, assuming you or we lived through it, we win the war, and we have a country afterwards. It was bad. In the winter of '77, Washington's army was in retreat, running again from the British. They went to Valley Forge, Virginia. Now it's a national park, I think, some sort of park. He had about 12,000 soldiers going into the winter of Valley Forge. Winter conditions were terrible. It was freezing. It was cold. They were out of food. Some people didn't even have shoes, boots. They were starving. It was really bad. Nearby farmers refused to give food or shelter because, of course, they themselves would then freeze and starve to death. Although there was also a lot of Quakers around there. And Quakers didn't believe in war. And therefore, they were refused to help Washington, even though they were Americans and they may not have been loyalists. But because they didn't believe in war, they would not contribute anything to an army. So they wouldn't give up any food or supplies or shelter or anything. Some of it was taken by force by Washington soldiers. Of course, you had loyalists. There were loyalists, always some loyalists around, and they're unwilling to help. Unless you have a gun pointed at their head, you're not going to get them to help. He lost over 3,000 soldiers that winter. 4,000 soldiers, pardon me. He lost over 4,000 soldiers that winter. He went in with 12, he left with 8,000. Part of them died, part of them simply deserted. It was bad. It was the worst winter. Was the worst winter of the fight. There was certainly a silver lining to this. Washington's determination, he was able to hold it together. Many people say this is one of the key factors in us winning the war was simply George Washington. It really was. His determination, his grit, his strength, his will. Um, yes, he lived a better life. He rode around on a horse while the rest of the soldiers walked on the freezing, muddy ground. He slept in a nice warm tent, as all officers do. Officers always have it better off, especially generals, have it much better off than the common man. While everyone else is starving, he has a full meal every night. Supposedly, he did sacrifice as well, but he still had a much better life than the soldiers who were actually doing the fighting and dying. He held it together, though. If he had not held them together through that winter, again, he lost a third of his army as it was. If he had managed to hold on to the rest, him and his officers, it would have probably would have been the end. Probably would have been the end. And yet, another very interesting thing that occurred. I don't know where he came from, Baron von Steuben. Well, I know he's Prussian. I know he's from Prussia, and he came over. I guess I don't know exactly what brought him over. Prussia had been at war with England before, so the Prussians and the English hated each other. Prussia doesn't, it's not a country that exists anymore. It is in Eastern Europe, probably around the region of like east of Germany, Poland, somewhere in that region there. Um, he came over and he trained Washington soldiers. He spent a couple months training them in marksmanship and how to fight and how to do tactics on a battlefield and movements on a battlefield, which is incredibly important. He trained them for months. When that winter ended and the next spring when they walked out of there, he had an actual army. He had a real army because those 8,000 men that were left were dedicated to him. They were dedicated to each other, or dedicated to the promise of land or money. Um, he had an actual military when this ended. He had 8,000 well-trained, experienced soldiers. No, they still weren't as well trained as the Redcoats, but they were fighting for a cause. Many of them were fighting for a real cause, while the Redcoats were, the general Redcoat soldiers just fighting for a paycheck. It meant something. It really did. It meant something. It really created an actual army, maybe for the first time. 2 years into the war, and Washington really actually has a real army for the first time. Again, how significant it was that he kept it together for 2 years. Had at any time in those 2 years he been captured or a big part of his army had been captured, the war would have ended before he ever got to this point. So the French, the Treaty of Alliance is what it's called, where the French agreed to have an alliance with us. They signed this alliance in 78. Provided money, supplies, and troops, although money and supplies were pretty much all we got for the first 2 years. Close to the first 2 years, we just got money and supplies. Finally, we do around 80 or so, they do finally start sending us troops. We'll talk about in a minute. This creates an international war. Good for America, bad for England. Previously, England was just having to deal with us, our little upstart colonies. Now this was international. Now they were at war with another great empire, the French. And soon they're going to be at war with another great empire, the Spanish. Ultimately, multiple countries jump on the American train. Sorry, there's no trains yet. Although, actually, I take that back. There probably are trains in England at this point, but not in America yet. They jump on this train, and it isn't about helping us. Make sure you understand that. All these alliances that other European countries start to make with America, we end up allying ourselves with several countries. It isn't about us. They're not in it to help us. They're in it to hurt England and to take a piece of England's pie. That's what it's about. This war becomes international. We now start to see this war move to Canada. We start seeing conflicts in Canada, the West Indies, Southeast Asia, Indonesia. We start seeing conflicts off of in China, Indochina, Southeast China. We start seeing issues. We now have the British ships being attacked around the world. Anywhere the British Army goes, they now, or the Navy has to deal with, are those ships French ships or Spanish ships or Portuguese ships? Everybody was getting in on this. All to take the top of the guy at the top of the mountain down, the British, which is what the British sort of feared would happen. That's why they had to get us. They had to stop us because they feared this could go global. Well, it did go global. It took them 2 years for this to really go international war. They had 2 years to shut us down. They couldn't capture Washington. They couldn't stop it in those 2 years. Now it has gone really international. The French requirements is they want parts of the West Indies. They want some of those sugar islands in the West Indies, some of those slave islands. The French were still fine using slaves. Well, the British were still using slaves too at this point. In all America, the American side of the treaty was simple: U.S. sovereignty, life, liberty, and sovereignty and independence of America. That's all they wanted out of it. These were the terms of the treaty. We will both work together to fight against the British until we both get what we want. Freedom and independence for us, and the French get some territory from the British. The Spanish, when they join, same thing. The Spanish want Florida back and stuff like that. So the war rages on. The British government becomes increasingly concerned about riots or uprisings in Ireland, the West Indies, in Southeast Asia, India. They're really worried about losing India. Other than us, India was probably their biggest moneymaker, their biggest revenue source was the India region. So they're worried about that. Ireland had a lot of Catholic and Irish, and the Catholic and Irish basically hated the British, so they were worried about that. Revolts there. They're worried about slave revolts on their islands. In 1778, Prime Minister North actually starts to give in. He starts repealing laws. He gets Parliament to repeal some laws like the Tea Act and some other taxes. And he then communicates to the colonies, we would like to discuss terms. Discussing terms means discussing a peace treaty. England actually backs down and in 78 says, let's start talking about peace. Of course, what's that tell the colonists? If England's already talking about peace and they want to end this conflict, that can only mean one thing. England is scared. They're concerned. They're worried. They're afraid of what might happen had its cases keep going. The colonists refuse. The Continental Congress says, no, we won't stop. We're going to keep going. And the war continues. The war shifts to the south, though. In the first 2 years, almost all the fighting was in the northern colonies, the free colonies. Now the fighting shifts to the south. England actually chooses to abandon the northern colonies. At this point in time, had a peace treaty been signed, the northern colonies, New England, New York, up to New York and Boston and all that, would have probably gotten independence. We would have probably seen a small independent American country with maybe 8 colonies or 9 colonies. Had this ended at this point, very possibly, we would have had a smaller independent country. Probably. Well, they refuse. The war keeps going on. People keep dying. So England gives up on the north and actually switches to a strategy of the south. They're now most focused on keeping the slave colonies, which were more loyalists. They're also concerned about the West Indies because they're worried that this war might actually spill all the way down the entire seaboard. It might spill all the way through the colonies, all the way through Florida, and then it might simply hop from Florida right into Cuba and the other Caribbean islands. And England actually stands to lose a lot more than just the American colonies. Remember those charts we saw in the last chapter? The biggest source of revenue per white person was the Indies, the West Indies, the Caribbean. So they wanted to really ensure that they got a real good, strong hold of the southern colonies. So even if they lost the Patriot regions, the northern colonies, they wouldn't lose the southern colonies, which were lots of revenue and lots of cash crops Lots of slave revenue and sugar plantations, etc. So they switched to the Southern strategy. Um, they attacked the Southern states. They invade through Savannah, Georgia, a naval attack with ships and soldiers. They capture Savannah, Georgia. They continue on up through the Carolinas, through Georgia, pretty much to capture all these southern states. And they actually are quite successful. Lots of loyalists, lots of open land, not many cities, and most of the Patriots are up north. This is actually quite successful. It's a smart strategy, honestly. Washington is forced to come down and fight unfamiliar territory. He's forced to come down and fight where a lot of the local population don't actually support the war. So it was a challenging situation. But Washington come down, he fights. Um, the British do focus on the South. The problem is, in 1780, the French finally show up. The French finally show up, and they show up with thousands of soldiers, altogether like 6,000 soldiers. And these are well trained professional soldiers, just like the British. They are a match for the British. In addition to Washington now having, at this point in time, by 8081, Washington has almost 20,000 soldiers again. So Washington has a big army now, considerably bigger than the British. Plus, we now have 5 or 6,000 French well trained professional soldiers coming in. The tables have turned. Washington comes up with a plan. He comes up with a strategy to actually surround the entire southern British army and force them to surrender. Truthfully, there isn't a lot of dying that goes on in the revolution. There's a few thousand, don't quote me on the exact number, but there's only a few thousand people that actually, a few thousand Americans that actually die in the war. More actually die of disease and malnutrition and starvation and freezing to death than actually die of war wounds. Um, so this is another situation. He comes up with a plan. The French come in, the Americans come, Washington comes down, the French sail up. They have an armada, which is a naval fleet, a war fleet. They come an armada show up, which goes after the British ships. They drop an army in the Rhode Island area, which then marches down. And ultimately, Washington's plan works. They march in the Washington army. They march in the French army. They surround General Cornwallis, the British general, who is then forced to surrender at Yorktown, Virginia. Is that Virginia? Yorktown, Virginia, in October of 81. Washington had 20,000 men. The French had, we'll say, 6,000. Surrounding, I don't have any troops here. The British had. The British Army surrenders in 1781 at Yorktown. Effectively, that's it. War's over. Now, the war doesn't officially end for several years because a war isn't officially over until you have a treaty signed. This is effectively the armistice, the truce. After 1781, there's a few more skirmishes, but there's no real large battles any longer because the French actually bring over more soldiers and Washington's army grows even bigger because, hey, they're winning, they're victorious, they're defeating the British. People are willing to join then. People love to be on the winning side. This gives you an idea. Washington is in the blue. Washington's army is in the blue, and again, he's the lead general. I don't want to use major; that's a rank officially. He's the lead general, but there's other generals as well. The green are the French that come in. Lafayette is certainly a significant. Lafayette and Barras come in. Rochambeau, I love that name, Rochambeau. Anyway, these other generals come in, these admirals come in, and it's really important. It's significant. They end up surrounding around Yorktown. They surround the British, and the British surrender. Not without some people dying, but generally speaking, it's minimal blood loss, honestly, compared to how European battles often go. Europeans are known for having battles where 100,000 people die, or wars, pardon me, not a battle, but a war where 100,000 people will die. So this is relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, although major on the other aspect of it, where it creates, well, effectively, it allows the creation of the United States by this happening. So it's certainly important and significant. Patriot advantage. What was their advantage? Well, Washington, for one. Washington was. We're lucky he was on our side because he did at one point work for the British. Um, he was smart. He was a good tactician. That was the word you used. I used strategist or something earlier. That might be a word too, but I think tactician's a better word. Certainly. Parliament actually debated this for weeks after all this sort of fleshed out. Parliament in England actually debated how the hell did we win, and it took them weeks to sort of figure it out. And they came to some conclusions. They really blamed most of it on France and Washington. They pretty much said Washington's strategy, Washington's ability to avoid being captured, Washington's ability to keep his soldiers moving and to keep his army together, certainly. And then, of course, France. France was the major thing. I mean, it doesn't matter what Washington did. At the end of the day, if we hadn't had France come in, Washington probably wouldn't have been able to defeat the British. We might have got half a country. We might have gotten the northern colonies, but the British were really coming in. They were starting to build military bases. They were starting to build military garrisons in Carolina and Georgia. The British were moving in to stay in Carolina and Georgia. They were not going to leave, and they were going to get dug in. So very possibly without the French alliance, we would have lost completely, or we would have only gotten maybe half of our colonies independence. Um, and you can certainly thank Washington for a lot of that. And then France, of course, France giving us money and supplies and soldiers finally at the end. We think about one third of the colonists were patriots, about one third were loyalists. And then the other third were, undecided on the fence, people that didn't really seem to go either direction. They simply wanted to stay out of it. A lot of people did. A lot of people wanted nothing to do with this. I mean, many of the colonies didn't even see really battles. For several colonies, there wasn't a single major conflict fought. So many people in the colonies, even though the whole trade was cut off and they had to adjust to a wartime economy, many of them didn't even get directly involved in the conflict. So there was a lot of neutral people, I suppose. Another reason we won was currency taxes. It's not a real tax. We call it a currency tax. It's basically inflation. The fact that the currency value kept declining so much that it's effectively a tax on the currency. That imagine currency, if you want to use a dollar bill, then you charge an 8% tax on it. That means your dollar bill is really only worth 92 cents. I'm not doing perfect math here, but effectively it's worth, 90% of what it was before. Well, what if that tax is 30%? Then your dollar is only worth 70 cents. What if your tax is 90%? Then your dollar is really only worth a dime. That's what it amounts to. The fact that inflation kept rising and the fact that something you could buy for a dollar today, tomorrow costs $2. That means your dollar was what value? Your dollar is half the value it was. If you could buy something for a dollar today and it costs $2 tomorrow, the same exact item, your dollar has now lost value. It's half as valuable. So that is what we call a currency tax. You still have the same dollar bill, but the difference is today it's a dollar and tomorrow it's only worth 50 cents, and in 2 years it's only worth 5 cents. Still says a dollar, but it's only worth a dime or a nickel. That's a currency tax. It's not a real tax, but it's an effective tax, meaning your currency has no value. But how did we win? Because we kept putting the money out there. By the end of the day, people have entire billfolds full of dollars, full of revolutionary dollars. If you got one today, by the way, it's worth real money. That's what like to collectors. Talk to your grandpa. Uh, but that's how it really effectively did. People kept getting the dollars. They kept having the money, and they just kept printing it. It was like paper. They just kept printing the money, but it really had no value. Yeah, as they said, a lot of times the money is just better to throw in the fireplace and keep you warm at night. That's about how effective it is, really, how valuable it is. Finally, after about 2 years of negotiation, we come to the Treaty of Paris. By the way, there's been many treaties of Paris. They just call them that because that's where they do the treaty, I guess. And you have some actual folks sitting down to do the treaty here, the Treaty of Paris. You have Washington, you have Franklin there. Um, Treaty of Paris is negotiated. It's signed in '83. Takes about 2 years. Why did it take 2 years? Really, England, really France and Spain is why it took 2 years. France and Spain didn't really get anything out of the war. They wanted more out of the war. France and Spain joined us because they wanted to take England down a notch. Well, I mean, they did. They lost the colonies. That certainly takes them down a notch. But did France or Spain gain anything from us? No, not really. They didn't want to just knock England down. They wanted to actually take some of England's power. So they continued debating and arguing. They wanted the West Indies, which didn't really happen. England didn't really lose the West Indies. It gave formal recognition of independence to America. This is what officially recognizes America as a country. This is what officially recognizes as a country. England recognizes us as an independent sovereign country in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. And England, once they recognize us, that makes us real. That makes us legit, if you will. As England's power in the world, if they said we're a real country, legitimate country, well, we are. I mean, there's no official documentation or any type of official government anywhere who says, okay, you're a real country. But once England signs a treaty and says, all right, you are, then, well, effectively we are. No land for Native Americans. The Native Americans chose the wrong side. Here's a good argument to be made. Was there a right side for the Indians to choose? Was there any side the Indians could have chosen that would have been beneficial to them, that would have really helped them? British, French, American? It's a discussion question, I suppose. Is there any direction the Native Americans could have actually gone, any side they could have chosen, which would actually been beneficial to them? And furthermore, why? Why or why not? Really, why or why not? What were their options? What were their choices? Why could they not choose a side that would be beneficial? Or if they could have chosen one, what was it? Um, in this particular case, they sided with the British and it didn't work out well. They got nothing out of it. If anything, the British actually signed over all the lands all the way to the Mississippi River. That is the entire third of North America. It doesn't include Canada, but everything else, the third of North America, what becomes the United States. They sign it over and say, you can go all the way to the Mississippi River, it's all yours. That increases the size of the colonies like 4 times. It's a massive increase. Most people still lived at the time of the war within 100 miles of the coast. Mississippi River is, I don't know off the top of my head, but probably 1,000 miles away, 800 miles away, something like that. So it dramatically expanded the size of what becomes the United States, the initial United States. They agreed to let him do that. And as I said, the Spanish and the French get very little out of it. Finally, they do sign a treaty. The Paris Treaty was between England, America, and the Indians. And then the Treaty of Versailles is between England, France, and Spain. And they don't really get much out of it. It ends the war. All the war is over now by 83 with everybody, but Spain and France don't anywhere get what they expected. Really, the winner in this war, there is only really one winner, and that's us. Very clearly, the only real winner of the American Revolutionary War is America, is the United States, what becomes the United States. No one else, of course, England was a big loser, but even France and Spain didn't really gain much out of it. This gives you an idea. So most of America, most Americans lived right in this area here, within 100 to 200 miles of the coast. That's where most people lived. Now, suddenly, we're expanded. This is the Appalachian Mountains, where people were just going up to the Appalachian Mountains. Now, all of this is open. All of this territory, which is all uninhabited, quotes. According to the Americans, it was all open land where no people lived. Of course, that's bullshit. It was full of hundreds of thousands of Native Americans. But to the American colonists, as far as they were concerned, it was no people. It was nobody important. The Native Americans were simply, a roadblock, an impediment, a speed bump to be overcome. All of the Mississippi River. All this territory is given to America, although they do have some contested lands down here. I think this is contested with Spain. This is land that's actually contested with Spain or France. Really Spain, I think. Spain still controlled Florida, and this land down here is questionable territory, whether it's Spanish or British or American. Yeah. You see the Native American tribes, you see a lot of them listed here. this really is few, to be honest. In the 1600s, we think there might have been as many as 300 Indian tribes in the Americas. This is what, 20 or so listed on here? Maybe the biggest ones, the most well-known ones, but there were hundreds. So we're creating republican institutions from 1776, 1787. We're going to talk about the Articles of Confederation here and the American Constitution. So, state constitutions, how much democracy? Well, during 1776, many states wrote new constitutions. Once we declared independence, many states decided to rewrite them. They were encouraged to do this by the Second Continental Congress. In essence, what the states were wanting to do was reject anything that in any way resembled a monarchy, like the king in England, or anything that put too much power in the hands of the wealthy, also like England, where the wealthy pretty much ran everything. It was the idea of the government of the people for the people, all the people, what we would call a republic where the government is supposed to be for the people, it is supposed to protect people's rights, protect the populace. In 1776, Pennsylvania wrote, again, many states did this, Pennsylvania's constitution knows particular interest. Wrote a very controversial one. It was also very influential upon what would be both in and left out of our Constitution. Pennsylvania created a constitution where all tax-paying men were granted the right to vote and hold office. The full franchise is what it's called, complete suffrage, the ability to both vote and hold office. Very important. All tax-paying men, which were just about all men, uh, white men, non-slave. Let's see what else. They also created a unicameral legislature. That's a one-house legislature. Here in the U.S., we have a two-house. The United States Congress has a House and a Senate, has a bicameral legislature. They created a unicameral. This is one of the things we leave out of the Constitution, believing too much power in the hands of just in essence, what we were trying to get away from. All the power in the hands of an elite small group of people. Um, I believe it also did not have a governor, so it had no actual executive body. It was just this rule. It was in essence what Pennsylvania was creating was a sort of like an oligarchy. Not exactly because these were elected positions, but still the only people that typically ran and held office in this time period were the upper classes. So you would still end up with a situation where pretty much an oligarchy is where a government is run by a small group of elite. And it still would have been something similar to that. Similar to it. They didn't like that. A lot of people criticized that. 1776, we have another interesting thing that occurs. John Adams writes Thoughts on Government. He encourages a mixed government. John Adams suggests a three-branch government, an executive, a judicial, and a legislative branch of government. Interesting way of looking at it, and very popular at the time, although it was a little different. Of course, incredibly significant because that's what we get. That's exactly what we get, is what John Adams suggests. Democracy, while it lasts, is more bloody than either aristocracy or monarchy. Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There is never a democracy that did not commit suicide. There have been no truly successful democracies up to this point in time. Our founding fathers did not want to create a democracy. They wanted to create a government that was run by the best and the brightest, by the most educated and capable men. That doesn't mean regular people couldn't vote, but those running for office should ideally be the best qualified, not regular men. And women were not included in this at all. Our founding fathers did not really want to create a real democracy. They create a sort of this, what we will call a Republican democracy, really the first one ever. It tried to balance protecting and representing all people while simultaneously trying to focus the power in the hands of those that they believed were most capable of wielding it successfully. Tough line to walk. However, we do get a democracy in America in some form for the first time. And we really see how government changes. Before the revolution, you can see that the majority of people in power, 1/3 of people in North are wealthy, and then half the people are middle class or above. So the majority of people in power are well off. Not all elite, but well off. Only 17% of common workers, common people, were in power. After the revolution, look at the numbers. The vast majority of your people in political office in New England are common, regular people. Quite a change. Quite a change. In the South, it's not quite as obvious. It's not quite. It happens. I mean, obviously, you can see the bar shift, but it's not quite as obvious in the South. We see an increasing of the numbers of common people in office, but it is much more limited. You still see the power of the wealthy. Fully a third of the government is still just the elite. And even almost half of the government is still the better off. All of these folks would have probably been slave owners in the South. So we see a shift in the South towards a more Republican government. And again, this has nothing to do with a political party, just the idea of a government that represents the people. We see more of a shift, a much bigger shift in the North, a smaller shift in the South. However, in both places, we see a significant change, just larger in the North. All right, during the Revolution, we did have a government. We had a constitution. We called it the Articles of Confederation. Really bad. The Articles were approved in 77 by Congress. They formed a very loose union. Each state was given one single vote, regardless of size, regardless of population, regardless of wealth. Everybody was equal. No executive, no chief executive, no president, no judiciary. It was sort of like what Pennsylvania did. It was just a one house legislature that was the Congress and made all the rules, made all the decisions. This group of 50 or so men. This left Congress to do everything. Congress had the power to declare war, borrow money, make treaties, settle disputes, print money for the common defense, and everything. Congress had all the power to do everything. Settle disputes, which would be like judiciary. I mean, it just did everything. Um, too much power in the hands of too few people, certainly. But still, it was weak. Most of the power was left with the states. It couldn't tax. The states had to decide on taxation. Um, this is what the states wanted. This is what the people wanted. The our founding fathers, if you will, that's what they wanted initially. Was a not a strong central government because they were afraid of that. Because it would be too similar to a monarchy and parliament in England, where all the power is in the hands of the wealthy. So they tried to create a government where the power is much more spread out to the states. Unfortunately, it made it incredibly weak. And interestingly enough, as a result of creating the articles, which demonstrated that you needed a powerful central government because we didn't have one, and our government floundered and looked terrible, and nothing worked right, and our government went into a terrible financial crisis. It went bankrupt, everything. It proved to our leaders that we actually needed a strong central government. There had to be controls on it. There had to be boundaries placed on it. So it didn't look like England's government. But at the same time, we still needed a strong central government. So, ironically enough, by the creation of the Articles, which was a very loose confederation of states sort of working together, it taught us that we actually needed a strong central government. We couldn't go with this loose confederation of states, it wouldn't work, which is what we ended up creating in the Constitution, a very strong federal government, central government, which if you asked them in 1776, they would have had no interest in that. But a decade later, that's exactly what they want. Um, Very interesting. This Articles of Confederation was almost useless to govern a country. It was decided almost immediately, within the first year or two, that it had to be rewritten, had to be changed. And so they were already talking about changing it in the 70s and redoing it. Well, we do more than that. The Articles had no power to tax. That was one of its biggest weaknesses. It couldn't tax. So through the entire war and after the war, we had a financial crisis. I talked about part of it before. During the war, we just printed useless money. We couldn't tax, of course, due to the fears of an internal rebellion. The government was bankrupt. We created a bank called the Bank of North America. And the Bank of North America was supposed to be an actual government bank. And it was supposed to regulate the economy. It was supposed to print money and take care of loans and things like that. So to sort of run our government, to make sure all the bills got paid, if you will. Um, it was supposed to pay off the war debts because we incurred war debts with our allies, pay army expenses, all this kind of stuff. It was sort of our, well, today, of course, we have the Department of the Treasury. The Treasury Department deals with all these things, deals with all the finances. Plus, we have a whole separate banking system, the Federal Reserve System, which did none that existed in this time period. This Bank of North America did everything between managing the economy and paying the bills. It was a bank for our government. It was ineffective, unfortunately. It had no revenue. How can a bank give out loans, and how can a bank pay off loans, and how can a bank pay bills and pay salaries to the soldiers if it has no money? It had no money because they weren't taxing anything. It couldn't generate revenue. So literally had to borrow money from other places to how's that go, like rob Peter to pay Paul. That's an old saying. Um, they had to borrow money from A so they could pay B, and then they owed A again. It just was really a pain. They do get an interesting idea though. One way to generate revenue, which keeps them from going out of business completely, is generating by selling off frontier lands, especially as the war comes to a close and we realize we've got all this extra land now because England is going to allow us to really expand into North America and just sign over all that land to us to the Mississippi River. Well, when they do that, we start selling it all. We start selling millions of acres. So dirt cheap, like a couple dollars an acre. Even by the time of Jefferson in the 1800s, I think we were selling some of the stuff for $2 an acre. Really cheap. Almost anyone could get together enough money to go out and buy farmland. Well, that helped. That certainly helped. The treaty was in 83. And so from the early 80s on, we were selling off this land, which was really useful. It generated money for the government, plus it enticed people to go out and colonize the Midwest, sort of, to move to the frontier and start building towns and communities. Of course, Native Americans lived out there all over the place. So the idea was that we could just go take the land because England had claimed it and given it to us. But what about all the Indians living on it? No one seemed to care about that. Keeping with this idea of generating revenue in the frontier in 1787, again continuing on with it, our Congress passes the law, the Northwest Ordinance, creates a brand new territories, the Northwest Territories. Basically, all that area north of sort of, I don't know what you want to say. Like think like where Louisiana, Mississippi are, all that area north. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, all that area creates all that territory up there. It's not a state, it's just open territory selling off the land. They also decide it's not going to be slave. There's not going to be any slavery allowed there either. Um, Slavery is prohibited. Little money was set aside to establish public schools, vocational schools, training schools. After all, if we're going to try to force a lot of people out to the frontier with really cheap land, then we need to sort of train them and teach them how to get an education and also how to be farmers. Because a lot of people didn't know how to be farmers, especially if you're moving from the city. So you had to sort of train them how to be a farmer, how to cut down trees and build houses and plant crops, etc. Also, we establish our rules for creating new states, our application guidelines. Um, yeah, this does become a problem, though. Yeah, you can't just admit states willy-nilly. You have to actually decide the standards for admitting them. And slavery, of course, becomes an issue soon. We'll talk about how some states want to be slave states and some don't. And Congress has different opinions on this. When a population reaches 5,000 men, then the territory could elect a government, a legislature. Then, when it reached 60,000, they could actually write a constitution, submit it to Congress, wait for Congress's approval, and then Congress would admit them into the U.S. So 5,000 men to start forming a government, and then at 60,000, you could write a constitution, submit it to Congress, ask for approval to join as a new state. And this was the process we used for, well, a very long time. This was a process for adding pretty much all through the 1800s. This was a process we used um, to expand our country westward. This gives you an idea of the territories, the land. This was pretty much all that land that was given to us as part of the treaty. England said we could pretty much populate all this land. Uh, seemed to be no regard for Native Americans, of course. Immediately, everybody claimed it. The American government claimed most of the northwest part, but then the states went out and claimed big sections too. Immediately, the states went out and claimed entire new state-sized chunks of land and said, "This is ours. We're going to use it." And especially the southern states really did it. And the southern states were entirely motivated to do it for the expansion of slavery. They need to have productive, effective plantations. You need large amounts of farmland. So the southern states wanted to extend slavery and grow slavery, especially once the Northwest Ordinance is passed, which is all this Northwest Territory, and it states no slavery. The southern states are really, really motivated to go out and claim the territory that is not in the Northwest Ordinance because they want to lay a claim and say slavery is here. They want to extend slavery. And with the Northwest Ordinance saying no slavery, they want to ensure in the South that it's very clear to the government we are going to extend our authority and we are going to extend slavery. So it was about staking a claim for the expansion of the slave society. As since the U.S. had already sort of staked a claim on the northern half of it and said no slavery, so it was significant. All right, now we're going to get to the actual Constitution. The rise of a nationalist faction. So money, debts, taxes, tariffs, these were all the things they were thinking about when the new Constitution was debated initially at Annapolis, Maryland in 1786. Some wanted a very strong central government, what we call a national perspective. Some wanted to control, they in essence believed the government should control most aspects of any type of governmental decisions, should all be centralized in one location. So our entire our laws, our entire societal structure should really be based in one governmental body. Some believe this, especially taxation. Taxation was really important for everybody. Pardon me. Duties and tariffs. The largest colonies, the big colonies, the middle colonies were large colonies, many of them like New York and Pennsylvania, for instance. They also wanted a very strong national government to control commerce, foreign trade. Foreign trade is very significant. Um, Maybe the largest source generation of revenue for the colonies was importing and exporting goods. So trade, very important. Southern colonies wanted no taxes. Everything that they did was import export. But the problem is it was they didn't just export goods, the slave products, they had to import everything else. So they sold a lot of their products to the market, to other countries, but they also had to import everything because they didn't want slaves making food or clothes or tools. The real money was in producing the slave goods like cotton or rice or sugar. So they imported all that other stuff they needed. So they weren't fans of any type of taxes on their imports exports. They didn't really like that. They didn't think it was necessary. This would impede their large imports and exports. It would really damage the Southern economy, many people believe. Plantation goods, things like this. At Annapolis, though, only a few people showed. Only a handful of representatives showed. And there were several states not represented. They decided there simply wasn't enough people there to make a decision. So they called for a second meeting the following year to really, now they're going to plan ahead of time. They're going to try to get all the states involved. And they really want people to come to rewrite the Articles of Confederation. They were not planning on writing a new constitution. They were going to fix the articles. That was the initial plan. They called for a meeting in Philadelphia the following year. And it happens. We end up calling this the Philadelphia Convention. This is where they actually write the Constitution. 55 delegates from all colonies but one showed up. Rhode Island did not show. Rhode Island is really small. And Rhode Island seemed to believe or seemed to think that they would not be treated fairly because they were competing literally with states that were 1,000 times bigger. Crazy. I mean, there were states that were so much larger than Rhode Island. They really didn't think they would get a fair shake. So they didn't send anybody. Most of the 55 people who did show up were nationalists. The national perspective. These are the ones that believe in a strong national government, a federal government, a singular government to rule over all others. Most were educated, property, lots of slave owners, the wealthy elite. They were. These are the men who create our government. So you should understand that our government created really is a government that leans more towards better, brighter, educated, more affluent people. It's a government that seems to be more beneficial to the upper classes and business interests. And most of these were businessmen as well. George Washington was chosen as a presiding official, of course. He was a hero of the Revolutionary War. He was chosen to preside over the Philadelphia Convention. There were basically two plans which emerged, two paths that most people were leaning towards for how to write the Constitution, or at this point in time, sort of how to fix the Articles. They hadn't completely decided to scrap the Articles yet, although that's coming soon. The two plans go basically like this. The Virginia plan, which rejects state sovereignty and says most of the power should actually be with a national government. Most of the power should be in the hands of the national government. Virginia plan. Rejecting state power generally. A strong national government established by the people for the people. However, smaller states like New Jersey, They believed the states should actually have power. The states should control their own laws. Their belief was pretty well aligned this way. If there's a strong national government, it is going to really favor the strong, highly populated, larger states. If we create a strong central government, it is going to lean towards the majority. And the majority is in the big states. That's where most people live. So a strong national government is going to favor the big states. That was what many people believed. So some of the smaller states leaned more towards the Jersey plan, which was giving most of the power to the states, having a very weak national government and a very strong state governments. Ultimately, a compromise is created over this large versus small state, Jersey versus Virginia, national government versus state government. So I guess it would actually be Virginia, national, large, versus the idea of Jersey's smaller state government plan. There came a suggestion that we would actually create a bicameral legislature, which we do, a two-house Congress, and this two-house Congress would have the two houses would be called the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate would have 2 members from every state. Thereby, all states were equal in the Senate. That appeals to the Jersey plan. That appeals to the small states. Because in the Senate, the smallest state will be equal to the largest state. 2 representatives apiece. Really benefits the small states. They could literally be outnumbered 1,000 to 1 by a bigger state, but in government, they're equal. Very beneficial to the small states. Gives them a great deal more power. And then they put in the House. The House of Representatives, on the other hand, is based on population. So therefore, the big states get more people. So the House of Representatives benefits the big states, where they get the most say. So we have 2 houses of government, one benefiting small states and one benefiting large states. They should balance each other out, is the idea behind it. The majority accepted this. The majority of the 55 delegates accepted the Great Compromise. They also create the judicial branch. They created a judicial authority, a court system, although it's very weakly defined in the Constitution. I mean, it's literally almost to the point of just saying, we're going to create a national court system. I mean, it's really almost that basic. I'm simplifying it a little, but not much. Our Supreme Court system has really taken on life of its own and developed almost entirely by tradition. It was never intended to have the power or the reach. Our entire court system was never meant to be this extensive, to where we have thousands of courts and millions of cases every year. It was never imagined for it to be this kind of extensive size, nor was the Supreme Court ever designed to be a check on every other part of the government, which it became. Which we will talk more about that later. Slavery. Probably the most contentious issue, other than the whole national versus federal power and state power. Governor Morris of New York, that's the actual picture of him there, Governor Morris of New York. He condemned slavery at the convention, arguing it was a nefarious institution, evil, dangerous institution, deceptive. Nefarious also implies deception. So many Northerners were already at the point here at the Revolution of the making of the Constitution that they didn't want slavery. Again, they had already declared Northwest Ordinance, no slavery. So there were many in the North that were already ready to reject slavery completely and walk away from it, claiming that they didn't need it, it didn't even affect them. It's actually not true. Many of the goods the South purchased, they purchased from the North. So the reality is the Northern economy was intricately tied up with the Southern slave economy. But Most Northerners were willing to simply abandon slavery completely and just walk away from it. Morris, for instance, from New York. Yeah. Slaveholders understood this contradiction. They did. I wrote about it. They talked about it. They understood this contradiction between freedom and equality for all men created equal, and then the contradiction of holding slaves as in bondage. They got it. They knew it, which begs a much bigger question, right? If they understood that all men created equal is contradictory to slavery, obviously, why the hell did they leave it in? Why the hell did they not outlaw it? The answer to that is a complicated answer, which I guess I'll boil down to this. Had they tried to create a constitution which outlawed slavery, none of the southern states would have signed on to it. None of them would agree to it. And the Philadelphia Convention would have been a complete failure. There would have been no constitution. It seems to be that simple. Our government would have continued to flop along. Our entire new republic might have been in jeopardy because the articles weren't doing it. The articles were failing. The articles were not keeping our society together. They weren't paying the bills. We couldn't pay off our debts. Our governmental structure was collapsing with the Articles of Confederation. Uh, as they're discussing all these compromises and all these negotiations, they decide to scrap the articles. They decide the articles cannot be saved. They have to be tossed in the fireplace and they have to totally restart over. So people understood that the articles was a failure and it was a losing battle even trying to use them any longer. It simply didn't work. There had to be a new government created. Had the issue of slavery been forced out, if the issue of abolition or ending slavery had been forced upon the Southerners, they would have walked away. We feel very confident of that, historians. We feel very confident of this. There would have not been a constitution created, not like we're talking about here, had we tried to force this issue of ending slavery on the Southerners. It wouldn't have happened. So, what choice did the Northerners have? They were desperate. The economy was crumbling. They were going bankrupt. Everyone had lost confidence in the government. Um, where were they at? I mean, they were backed into a corner. So they did it, they created it, and they kept slavery in. Um, it's not actually in the Constitution. The word slavery or slave is not in the Constitution. They don't actually mention slavery in the Constitution, but it's there. It's implicit in the whole Constitution in many places. For instance, they end the trade of slaves. They don't use the term slave, but they end the slave trade effective 1808. That's 20 years hence. 20 years after all this is happening, slave trade will end. That simply means buying and selling slaves from outside the country. As we'll talk about when we get to that chapter, it doesn't matter anymore because by 1808, slaves are naturally reproducing. There's been enough women brought in the mid 1700s that there are now enough slave families that slaves are naturally reproducing. The southern slave owners don't need to buy slaves anymore. They probably already knew this in 1788 here, 87. They probably already got that, realized natural reproduction was occurring, so they were okay with that being put in. Um, of course, what most people are also familiar with is the Three-Fifths Compromise. Since the House of Representatives gives power to the big states based on population, if you only counted the white population, then you would have the big states having all their power reduced Some places in some of the larger the southern states like the Carolinas and Georgia, there were counties that were 80% black, and no black people would have been counted. So if black people had not been counted at all, then you would take a large southern state and it would be in the House of Representatives equal to a much smaller state, which entirely defeats the purpose of the House. The House of Representatives is to give large states more power. If you take away all the black population in these southern states who had a much smaller white population, you see all their power has gone away. So they create the three-fifths compromise, which means all non-white people will be counted as three-fifths of a person. So in essence, you're going to count 60% of the black population. They get no power to vote. They have no say in government. I mean, they're slaves, or a handful against some free blacks as well. Which actually gives the southern states even more power in the fewer hands. Because now you have every white person in the South basically equal to 1.6 of a white person. Because they're now taking on that 60% from a black. So it actually makes individual white voters and individual white politicians from the South much more effective and powerful, actually. It balances it and gives the power of the southern states in a much smaller group of people, which allows them to really dominate, create a white supremacist society, and yeah, well, it gives them exactly what they wanted, exactly what the slave owners wanted. What did we create? We created a constitution that was a strong national government. That's what we did. We created the strong national federal government under the Constitution. Gave the government some of the most important powers that the Articles of Confederation was lacking. Gave the government the power of taxation to levy and control and assess taxes in any way it saw fit. Also, the power of military defense, national defense, the power to control all commerce that went between the states or between us and other countries. So, control over commerce, taxation, national defense. Um, it also limited the states' rights. It made it very clear that the federal government, in all delineated powers, in other words, all named powers, in all delineated, spelled out powers, the federal government had total authority over the states. So when it came to commerce, taxation, national defense, anything like this, and of course many other things, the federal government, if it ever conflicted with the states over taxation or commerce, the federal government was always superior on any delineated ideas. It became the supreme law of the land. Um, all but 3 delegates signed it. Only 3 delegates withheld signing the Constitution. It should be noted, what they were doing wasn't really legal. We refer to this terminology as extra legal. Extra legal. It's not illegal and it's not legal. It is the gray area in between. They were all sent there to fix the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they tossed the articles and wrote a whole new government, created a whole brand new government, really from scratch. They were not supposed to do that. I mean, it's not like we're talking about the Declaration of Independence here, where they were committing treason and they could have been executed. It's nothing quite that drastic, of course. But what they did wasn't really legal. They did not have the authority to scrap our government, which is what they did. They scrapped the government, which we'd had for over a decade, and start all over again. I mean, 55 guys took it upon themselves to rewrite the entire government from scratch, which was not their purview. They was not sent there to do that. They were sent there to simply like tweak and fix the articles to try and make the government more effective, and instead they just started all over and wrote something entirely different. It was wonderful. This is considered by most constitutional scholars globally as one of the most effective constitutions ever created, um, because it's in essence very simple, and yet its simplicity is its power because it can be interpreted and expanded upon so easily, and yet it covers broadly all the important stuff. So it is, there's over 50 countries in the world today that have modeled their constitution on our constitution. So it worked, but they weren't supposed to do this. And then when they come out with this brand new constitution, and many people are scratching their heads, people who are in the know, and they're like, wait a minute, that doesn't look like the articles. What's that? Wait, you guys wrote a whole new constitution. And this created a big controversy, huge controversy over ratification of the constitution. Uh, yeah, really, if you think about this, 55 guys, 55 people, I believe there was one woman. I think there was one woman. So I keep saying guy. I think there was one woman. Deciding all of this, deciding that they knew best for the entire country, for millions of people, these 55. It's hubris. It's hubris, isn't it? Really thinking that you were that way. But nonetheless, they did. And it worked. So there you go. And the final thing, this is where we'll end the chapter. Ratification. This is where the Constitution has to be accepted by the states. The way it works is the Constitution's now written. They come out with this brand new thing, which surprises a lot of people. They make, of course, who knows how many copies, and they send it out to all the states, and many people read it. And they send it to all the legislatures, and the way it works is they determine. They just tired of it's totally arbitrary. They simply determine that the states are going to vote on it. The legislatures are the actual population. I think the population voted. Don't quote me on that, but I think the people actually got to vote. I'm not positive. Now I think about that, I'm not positive about that. We'll just keep it simple and say the states. That's generic enough, right? The states voted on it. And they decide that 9 of the states have to ratify it. 9 of 13, so that is, I guess, 3/4 or something like that. And they say 9 of the 13 states have to ratify it. And if 9 of the 13 states vote on it and approve it, as is, then it's done deal. It's our government. I guess to hell with the other 4 states. They either jump on board or go their own way, I suppose. This takes over 2 years. This is a 2-year process. I mean, they write the Constitution, they put it out there, and it takes over 2 years, almost 3 years before the original 13 states all ratify it. And of course, it was much different than anything they expected. It came out to be much different. A lot of people were concerned about it. We had 2 factions develop. I mentioned at the beginning of the chapter we'll briefly talk about factionalism. We'll really get into it a lot more in the next chapter. 2 factions develop: the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. I remember it's a strong federal government, so there's your Federalists. These are the people who support it. This is actually most of the original delegates. Most of the delegates to the convention were nationalists, or as they'll start calling themselves, Federalists, because they support a strong federal government, national government. But a few, along with lots of other people, after the Constitution was disseminated to the public, lots of anti-federalists spoke up and said, wait a minute, you wrote this thing, which is great, but you left out some really important stuff. Like, where is the protections of the rights and liberties? Which was the thing we were arguing for the whole damn revolution. All the things we challenged England on was, in essence, violations of our rights and liberties. Where is that in the Constitution? It's not. The Constitution, the original Constitution, really is just a frame of government. It really just outlines how the government's structured. It does not really deal with protecting our rights. It really doesn't. And many people said that's a problem. You created this thing, and this whole process, everything we've been going through for now over a decade, was all to get our rights and liberties guaranteed that were being abused by England. And you write a constitution which doesn't do anything to protect our rights and liberties. Duh. What's the problem? You might have created a great government, but where in there does it protect us? It really doesn't. Um, And so that was probably the biggest argument of anti-federalists. Too much power in the federal government, too little power to the states, and nothing that really protects the rights of the citizens. Lots of debate about this. Well, several people of these Federalists write what we call the Federalist Papers. The three men there on the bottom: James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. And they write the Federalist Party. These are Federalists. They believe in this. They believe in the Constitution. They believe what they created was great. They believe that it is the right answer for our country. And we sure as hell can't go back to the Articles. So they say, you all need to vote on this and approve it because it's really good. And they write these essays? Try essays. They write these essays, about 85 essays. And again, they publish them publicly. They write these essays, what we call the Federalist Papers, and they're put out there in the public. They're published for the public to read and to discuss and talk about, and their arguments, their theses, arguments for the Constitution and its authority, saying the Constitution's great, the Constitution is going to protect us, and it's going to do so many things. It is really a wonderful document. It isn't perfect. Nothing is perfect, but it is what we need right now in our country's crisis. We need this strong federal government. And these are these Federalist Papers. You can look this up online. Really easy to read. Okay, easy to find, and most of them are pretty small. Not necessarily easy to read. Um, Sometimes the way these folks talk is a little bit odd. Um, all this supporting a strong national government. The Anti-Federalists had some issues. First of all, he said it didn't really protect the rights of citizens. Another problem is they believe the office of the president created in the Constitution is way too much like a king. The office of the president is way too much like a king. Hell, even John Adams. John Adams proposed the official title of the president, His Majesty the President. Um, Yeah, John Adams, even though he does ultimately come down on the Patriot side, John Adams, he was just almost a loyalist towards until the end, until really all got down to it during the Revolution. He was sort of a loyalist. He really liked England. He really did. He liked going over there. He liked England. So they really complained it was going to be government of the elite. They also complained that the president would be too much like a king, stuff like that. That elite part, fortunately, is true. Congress in Washington really does become comprised of elite men. It still is today. The majority of people in Congress today are millionaires. Most of them are lawyers. Uh, they're rich. So even today, Congress is of the elite. It really is. They do convince enough of the public that there will be the separation of powers between, um, the executive, judicial, legislative branch. In essence, the separation of powers between three branches of the government will be enough that between that and the checks and balances on each part, that the president will be checked. The president will be watched over. Truthfully, the actual president, if you compare it to today, the executive branch in the Constitution is very weak. It's created with very limited powers. The executive branch today is far stronger than it was ever envisioned by our founding fathers. The executive branch today is almost a monarch. The executive branch today, the president today has so much power, it can do so many things with executive orders. It's really almost a quasi king. It really is. Far more powerful than was envisioned. Anyway, they believe this will create a fair government, and they convince enough people. Um, Peoples in cities and coastal areas tend to lean Federalist. Cities, coastal areas in the Northeast tend to lean Federalist, while in rural populations tend to lean more anti-Federalist. Um, Smaller states seem to really like this national government now. Initially, they were very nervous about this national government, like Delaware and New Jersey. They didn't want the national government. They thought it was dangerous because they would get overlooked and ignored, as I said before. But with the way the government now had a checks and balances, a separation of powers, and the fact that the Senate had equal voice in Congress to the more larger states, we actually start to see a lot of smaller states jump on board and say, you know what, this actually does protect us. There is a real protection of authority for the states, and we will be watched over by this bigger government. It will sort of balance out the power between the small states and the big states. Larger states were convinced to ratify the Constitution, generally only when a Bill of Rights was added finally. The Bill of Rights is added, 1791. However, it's added after it's ratified. The 9 of the 13 states ratify this as of, I think, 89. So as of 89, we have a constitution. We have a country. Boom. It's there. We have a constitution. We have a country. It is all written down, and it's all official. There was no Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments, freedom of speech and freedom to bear arms, freedom of press and fair trial and religion and things like that. That was proposed in Congress, and they were writing it, and they promised that they would put it in, but it wasn't there when they ratified it. So they ratified it based on trust that it would be added. It was. The first 10 amendments were ratified in 1791, and you get the Bill of Rights as we know it today. There was actually about 17 amendments originally, and only 10 were ratified. So we could have had the Bill of Rights being 17 long. They whittled it down to 10. Most accept it. Most believe that it would give popular sovereignty to the people and also majority rule. Due to the voting rights, they really believe this would actually allow the majority to rule. That doesn't happen, really. For much of our history, the majority rule is not the case, actually. Our government is still generally run by the elite. But they believe majority rule is the case, and it could be the case, could have been the case. And popular sovereignty. In other words, the power of the government is in the hands of the people. We choose our elected officials. In other words, their power comes from us. Popular, the people. That's what we get. Congress adds a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, 10 amendments to guarantee individual rights. Yeah, they upheld their promise to add it in. And we create what is considered by many to be maybe the best constitution written in the last couple hundred years. Maybe the best constitution ever written, maybe. Because it covers everything, and yet it's actually relatively brief. There are some constitutions today that have been written that are 500 pages long. Far, far greater size in our Constitution. All right, well, that ends the chapter, and we're done with this chapter, and we will pick up right where we left off here in the next chapter. Take care.